Everyone thought that she had gone missing, but the only man who knew her whereabouts told the world his wife had vanished. He cried on television, he begged for information, he stood in front of cameras and asked strangers to help him find her. But she was in their home the entire time, frozen, then buried beneath the stairs he walked past every single day. Investigators didn't find her until 2023, and when they finally understood what he'd done, one detail stopped them cold. He hadn't just killed her, he'd taken the time to freeze her first. Her name was Tina Satchwell. Her husband's name was Richard. This is the case collector, and this is how he almost got away with it. If you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. This is where we cover the cases the headlines never told you the full story of. Also, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. The woman Tina Satchwell called her sister for most of her childhood was, in fact, her mother. She grew up believing her grandmother, Florence Dinjavan, was the one who had raised her from birth. It wasn't until she went looking for her own birth certificate, around the time of her confirmation, that she learned the truth. It would not be the last time the people closest to Tina kept something from her. She was born on the 30th of November, 1972, in Fermoy, County Cork. Tina wasn't an only child, or even one of a few. She was one of 8, raised in a large, crowded household on St. Bernard's Place in Fermoy. She spent her early years there, in her grandmother's house, before leaving home as a teenager. At 17, she moved across the water to Colville, near Leicester, in England, to live, once again, with her grandmother's side of the family. It was there, still a teenager, far from everything she'd known in Cork, that she met a man named Richard Satchwell. They married in Oldham in 1990. The date they chose was Tina's 20th birthday. For the next 26 years, Tina lived a quiet life. She and Richard eventually settled in Ireland, in a terraced house on Grattan Street, in the seaside town of Youghal, County Cork, a move they made together in 2016. The home had 2 dogs and a parrot Tina had named Valentine. Those who knew Tina as a child remember someone who couldn't walk past a stray animal without bringing it home. Her half-sister, Lorraine Howard, later said the two of them had spent much of their childhood ferrying injured animals to the vet, whether their parents liked it or not. That love followed Tina into adulthood. So did another habit, one that had nothing to do with animals at all. Tina loved fashion. She loved car boot sales, hunting for bargains, building an outfit out of something she'd found for €1. Her family would later say it wasn't a big part of her life by accident. Tina didn't drink. She rarely went out. Car boot sales and clothes were, in her sister's words, her escape. None of that would matter, in the end, to the people who eventually went looking for her. What mattered to them was something much smaller, a habit, one she never broke. Tina never left her dogs. Not for an afternoon. Not for an hour. People who knew her said it plainly. Tina Satchwell did not go anywhere without them. Tina would have turned 50 years old in 2022. That year, and every year her family kept searching, they marked her birthday not with a party, but with a vigil, one in Youghal, one in Fermoy, the town where she was born. At trial, years later, prosecutors and the defense painted 2 very different pictures of who Tina was. Her family said neither one was accurate, that the version of Tina described in that courtroom barely resembled the woman they'd grown up with. That's not where her story ends, though. It's where it begins, with a woman who loved a bargain, who never went anywhere without her dogs, and who, one ordinary day in March, apparently did exactly that. Richard Satchwell was born on the 16th of June, 1966, in Leicester, England. He made his living as a truck driver, long hours, long routes, the kind of job that keeps a man moving and mostly out of view. It was in Leicester, in the town of Colville, that he met a teenage girl named Tina Dingavan, newly arrived from Ireland to live with family. Whatever passed between them in those early years, only two people ever really knew. They married in Oldham in 1990, on Tina's 20th birthday. Richard was 23. It was the start of a marriage that would last 27 years. For most of that time, there is very little to say about Richard Satchwell. No headlines. No public record of note. A man who worked, who drove, who eventually moved with his wife to Ireland, first settling elsewhere, before the two of them relocated to a terraced house on Grattan Street in the seaside town of Youghal, County Cork, in 2016. By every outward account, theirs was simply a long marriage between two private people. But the official record tells a different story about Richard himself, one that has nothing to do with Tina at all. In 2001, Richard Satchwell was convicted of larceny, alongside a charge relating to a fraudulent tax disc. The following year, in 2002, he was convicted again, this time for social welfare fraud, an offense serious enough to send him to prison for a month. By the time he met Tina, and in the years that followed, that pattern would sit quietly in the background. A private man, a working man, and a documented history of lying to institutions to get what he needed from them. Whatever role that history played in the marriage, or in what came later, is not something the public record explains. It simply exists, filed away, years before anyone would think to ask what else Richard Satchwell had ever gotten away with. What else Richard Satchwell had gotten away with happened on the 19th of March, 2017. That was the last day anyone outside their home saw Tina Satchwell alive. She was seen that day at a car boot sale in Carrick-Touhill, doing what she always did, hunting for a bargain. By Richard's account, the next morning began ordinarily. He would later tell people that Tina asked him to drive to Dungarvan, roughly 30 kilometers away, to buy fish food and food for their parrot, Valentine. He left the house around 10:30. He says he returned just before noon. And that, according to Richard, was the moment his wife of 27 years disappeared. He said the house keys were on the ground. Her phone was left on the kitchen table. 2 suitcases were gone, along with roughly €26,000 in cash. Money he claimed the couple had kept in a box in the attic, never banked. Their dogs, the dogs Tina never went anywhere without, were still in the house. Richard did not report Tina missing that day, or the next. It would be 4 full days, the 24th of March 2017, before he walked into a Garda station and told them his wife was gone. That was the story Richard Satchwell told for 6 years. It was not the story he told once the truth came out. By his own later account, given only after Tina's remains were discovered, the real morning of the 20th of March unfolded very differently. Richard said he was making Tina breakfast when he heard scraping near the staircase. He said he found her there, chisel in hand, working at plasterboard he had recently put up. He said she turned on him, that in the struggle that followed, he held the belt of her dressing gown to her neck, believing he was protecting himself. He said she went limp within moments. That is Richard's account, not an established fact. His claim, and only his, about how his wife died. No one else was in that house to confirm or contradict it. What happened after is not in dispute. Richard placed Tina's body inside a chest freezer, kept in the shed behind their home. By his own explanation, it wasn't concealment he was thinking of first. It was the dogs. He said the animals would not leave her remains alone, and the freezer was where he put her to stop it. By his own account, Tina's body remained in that freezer for roughly 2 days. Then, on the 26th of March 2017, 6 days after her death, Richard dug a grave beneath the staircase inside their own home. He lined it with black plastic sheeting. He placed Tina inside, folded the plastic over her, and laid flowers on top, before filling the space with soil. Then he did something that would keep his wife hidden for the next 6.5 years. He poured concrete over her, a layer nearly a meter thick, sealed beneath the stairs of the house he continued to live in. 2 accounts, one man, and a version of events that only he was ever alive to tell. Whether Richard Satchwell was defending himself that morning, or whether the chisel and the dressing gown belt were details built to explain away something far more deliberate, is a question the courts would eventually have to weigh, with no witness and no surviving version of events but his own. For now, in March of 2017, none of that mattered yet. Tina Satchwell was gone, and the only person who knew where she was had already decided what he was going to tell everyone else. What Richard Satchwell decided to tell everyone else played out, again and again, on national television. In June of 2017, less than 3 months after Tina vanished, Richard appeared on RTE's Crime Call alongside her aunt, appealing directly to the public. He appeared distraught. He cried. That same month, on RTE's Primetime, he offered a detail he hadn't given Gardaí with the same certainty: that Tina had taken their €26,000 in savings with her when she left. By January of 2018, RTE had produced a full special on her disappearance. In March that year, Richard told the Ray D'Arcy show that a man had spotted a woman resembling Tina walking a dog on a beach in Dublin. He also said Tina had asked him for his UK national insurance number shortly before she vanished, as if she were planning to claim benefits from abroad. That same month, Cork radio host Neil Prendeville offered Richard something more direct: a lie detector test, live, on air. Richard agreed. Then, citing exhaustion, he pulled out. In one appeal, marking 2 years since she vanished, Richard said his arms would stay open for her until his last breath, that he would never stop loving her. He told reporters he greeted a photograph of Tina every morning. He said he'd kept every gift he had bought her: birthdays, anniversaries, Christmases, waiting for the day she came home to open them. For 6 years, that pattern held. Richard avoided print interviews, where his words could be checked against the page, and gravitated toward live television and radio, where the story could be shaped in real time, unedited. He gave the public a face, a voice, and a grief that read, to millions of viewers, as real. None of that squared with one basic fact. Gardaí established early on that Tina had never passed through an Irish or UK airport or port. Her passport was untouched. Her bank account had not been accessed since the day she vanished. Wherever Richard said she'd gone, the record showed she had never actually left. While Richard performed that grief in front of cameras, Gardaí were chasing him down a different road entirely, and finding nothing. In March of 2018, 60 officers sealed off 40 acres of woodland at Mitchell's Wood, near Castle Martyr, after a tip that a woman matching Tina's description had been seen entering the trees with another person, who was later seen leaving alone. Cadaver dogs went in. 12 days later, the search ended empty-handed. That same year, Richard told Gardaí he'd found 2 suitcases resembling Tina's, dumped at a clothing bank in a Tesco car park in Youghal. DNA testing came back. They weren't hers. Then, in January of 2021, a skeleton was uncovered at Roxborough, near Middleton. For a brief window, investigators wondered if the search might finally be over. It wasn't. The remains belonged to a woman in her 70s, decades older than Tina had ever been. Every one of those leads went nowhere, and every one of them kept the search looking everywhere except 6 feet beneath a staircase in Youghal. Journalist Barry Cummins was one of several reporters who spent time inside that house during those years, sitting for interviews just feet from where Tina lay. He would later write about the discomfort of realizing, only after her remains were found, exactly how close he had been. But investigators had already been inside that house, and they had already seen something. On the 7th of June, 2017, 10 Garda officers spent 12 hours searching the Satchwell home. They left with what the file described as nothing of evidential value. But photographs taken that day show something else. A newly built red brick wall beneath the staircase and unpainted plasterboard, fresh enough to still smell of construction. Investigators noted it. They photographed it. They did not dig. The same search turned up something else. A home officers described as unkempt. Dog feces still on the floor. A bird cage that hadn't been cleaned in months. Upstairs, on rails of clothing, were hundreds of outfits, some still wrapped in plastic, never worn. Tina, according to Richard, had left with 2 packed suitcases. Somehow, most of her wardrobe was still hanging exactly where she'd left it. 2 laptops seized during that same search sat unanalyzed for 4 years. It wasn't until 2021 that anyone opened them properly. When they did, they found that in the week Richard reported his wife missing, he had watched a video twice on how quicklime reacts with water, the chemical used for generations to mask the smell of a body left to decompose. Nobody, in 2017, had thought to ask why a truck driver was watching that. Richard would later complain, publicly, that Gardaí hadn't forensically examined his car until 7 months after Tina vanished. He meant it as criticism of the investigation. In hindsight, it reads as something else entirely. A man keeping score of exactly how slowly the people looking for his wife were actually looking. By the time detectives went looking for an answer to that question, Richard Satchwell already had a documented history of lying to institutions to get what he needed. In 2001 and 2002, it had been the tax disc, the social welfare office, small, contained deceptions, the kind that get a person a fine or a month inside. What changed in 2017 wasn't the instinct, it was the stage. A private habit of lying to systems became a 6-year public performance, broadcast to an entire country, and it worked for exactly as long as nobody had reason to check it against the facts. In his own words, given later to Gardaí, Richard would describe it simply: once the lies started, he couldn't stop them. That is not a clinical explanation. It's the closest thing to one that exists in his own mouth. A man who had, twice before, gotten away with lying to people whose job was to catch him, doing it again, on a scale he'd never had the platform for until a country's cameras were pointed at his grief. There was a second layer to that performance, one that went beyond lying about the day she vanished. In interviews, Richard began suggesting Tina herself had been the difficult one, telling one reporter she was, in his words, too much in love with herself, and claiming elsewhere that he had lived through a violent relationship, that Tina used to beat him. He offered no evidence for either claim. What he offered was doubt, a reason for the public to wonder if the missing woman wasn't quite who they assumed, while he stood in front of them, looking like the one who'd suffered. It is one thing to lie about where your wife went. It is another to spend 6 years quietly rewriting who she was, to the exact audience searching for her. Asked directly, in 2018, whether he thought someone had attacked Tina, Richard said it was something that crossed his mind, before adding that Tina wasn't the type to be a pushover, that if someone came at her, she'd pick up the nearest thing and hit back. He was describing, without anyone realizing what they were actually hearing, the exact version of events he would give Gardaí himself, 5 years later, once there was nowhere left to hide. The 2 lives, the grieving husband on screen, and the man who knew exactly where his wife was, never had to touch. Television didn't ask for proof. It asked for a performance. Richard had one ready. Whether that performance was rehearsed from the start, or something he talked himself into believing the longer it went on, is a question even the people who investigated him have never fully agreed on. By 2020, Gardaí had already logged over 370 separate lines of inquiry, more than 100 hours of CCTV footage, and statements from over 170 witnesses. None of it, on its own, had ever pointed at the staircase. That year, Twomey ordered the first full review of the file since 2017. She brought in a forensic archaeologist, Dr. Neff McCullough, to look at everything the original search had gathered, including those photographs of the red brick wall. McCullough flagged it immediately. A renovation, built at the exact moment a woman vanished, sealed beneath a staircase nobody had ever properly opened. She recommended what should have happened 4 years earlier, a full, invasive search, with a cadaver dog, of the space beneath those stairs. The 2017 search had not failed because there was nothing there. It had failed because nobody, at the time, understood what they were already looking at. By February of 2022, Twomey's team believed Tina Satchwell had never left that house at all. Believing something and proving it are not the same thing. It took investigators until July of 2023 to close that gap. Reviewing years of Richard Satchwell's own statements side by side, detectives found discrepancies serious enough to act on. Inconsistencies between what he'd told Gardaí in 2017 and what his phone and financial records actually showed. By August of 2022, Twomey's team already believed there were grounds to arrest Richard, but procedure required nearly 60 separate lines of inquiry to be formally closed out first, each one, on its own, insignificant. Together, they were what stood between suspicion and an arrest. On the 10th of October 2023, the investigation into Tina Satchwell's disappearance was formally upgraded to murder. Richard was arrested that day. He was released without charge less than 24 hours later, not because the case against him had weakened, but because the search of his home was only just beginning. That first search looked nothing like the one from 6 years earlier. Technical examiners arrived at Grattan Street with chainsaws, hedge trimmers, Kango hammers, shovels, and pickaxes, equipment built to tear a property apart, not walk through it. Richard sat through the full 24 hours Gardaí were legally allowed to hold him, and refused every offer of a break. What that search would find, investigators didn't yet know. But this time, they weren't leaving without looking. On the 11th of October, a cadaver dog named Fern was brought into the house on Grattan Street. Fern indicated at the base of the staircase, the same staircase Garda officers had photographed and walked past 6 years earlier. A searcher on scene, Garda Brian Barry, noticed something the 2017 search never had. The red brick wall beneath the stairs had been built poorly, uneven, rushed. He lifted the linoleum flooring nearby and found a patch of concrete that didn't match the rest of the floor. Different color, newer. The evidence that would end 6 years of searching had been sitting under a floor investigators had already stood on, more than once. The next day, the 12th of October, 2023, Gardaí broke through that patch of concrete with a jackhammer. Beneath it, roughly 64 centimeters down, they found black plastic sheeting. Inside it was Tina Satchwell. That same evening, Richard Satchwell was arrested again and formally charged with his wife's murder. Her identity was confirmed the following day through dental records. She had been buried beneath her own staircase in the home she'd shared with Richard since March of 2017. By then, investigators had also begun to understand the sequence Richard never told anyone. Before that concrete was ever poured, Tina's body spent time somewhere else entirely, inside the chest freezer in the shed, not for a night, long enough that the digging, the plastic sheeting, the flowers laid on top of her the concrete itself, weren't the actions of a man panicking in the moment. They were the actions of a man who had time to plan them, and used it. The case began moving toward trial in the months that followed. Whatever legal argument his defense would eventually build, self-defense, panic, a struggle that went too far, none of it explained the freezer. None of it explained the weeks, or longer, between a death he'd call sudden and a burial that was anything but. Asked, on the record, whether he understood the charge against him, Richard Satchwell said 4 words: guilty or not guilty, guilty. He did not explain what he meant by it. He never would. Garda Commissioner Drew Harris later admitted publicly that the site missed in 2017 had been, in his words, pretty obvious in hindsight. He ordered a formal review of the original investigation. In the Dáil, opposition politicians, Labour's Alan Kelly, Sinn Féin's Matt Carthy, pressed the question the whole country was now asking: how does a body sit under a staircase in a house Gardaí had already searched for 6.5 years? Nobody in an official capacity has ever fully, publicly answered that question. What came next would be decided somewhere else entirely, not by Gardaí, but by a jury. Richard Satchwell never took the stand. The jury heard his account of what happened that March morning, only through a recording, his own 2023 Garda interview, played for them in full. The trial opened at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin on the 28th of April 2025, relocated from Cork over concerns that local coverage made a fair hearing there impossible. Mr. Justice Paul McDermott presided. Geraldine Small argued the case for the state. Brendan Grehan argued for the defense. The legal question at the center of it was never whether Richard killed Tina. He had already admitted to burying her. The question was intent: murder, manslaughter, or self-defense. Grehan's argument rested entirely on the account Richard gave only after Tina's remains were found. He told the jury that lying afterward didn't prove murder, that people conceal what they've done, in his words, because they killed the very thing they loved, not necessarily because they meant to. There was one problem neither side could get past. No cause of death was ever established. 6.5 years underground had taken that certainty with it. No fractures were found. No forensic proof of how, exactly, Tina died. Only Richard's word for what happened in that room. The defense called a single witness, Tina's half-sister, Lorraine Howard. She testified that Richard had, at times, shown controlling behavior toward Tina during their marriage. It did not help him the way the defense needed it to. If anything, her testimony reinforced the opposite picture: a husband who exerted control over his wife long before anything happened to her, not a man defending himself against an unpredictable partner. On the 30th of May, 2025, after 4 days of deliberation, a jury of 7 women and 5 men returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder. Richard Satchwell showed no visible reaction. He was sentenced on the 4th of June 2025 to the only sentence Irish law allows for murder: life imprisonment. At sentencing, Tina's family made a deliberate choice. Throughout their statements, they referred to her not as Tina Satchwell, but as Tina Dingavan. Her cousin, Sarah Howard, told the court she had been murdered, in her words, by someone who claimed to love her, and asked the judge to weigh not just the killing, but the years of false hope Richard had let the family carry. Lorraine Howard told the court that being buried beneath the stairs, the place Richard could maintain, in her words, ultimate control over Tina, even in death, was something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She said she would never forgive him. Richard's barrister told the court his client had never intended to kill Tina, and that despite anything said during the trial, she had been, in his words, a lovely person. He confirmed on the record that Richard intended to appeal. That appeal was lodged the same day as his sentencing. It rests on 6 separate grounds. As of now, it isn't expected to be heard before 2027. In the legal sense, this case is not yet finished. Go back to the beginning of this, to a shed behind a house on Grattan Street, and a detail this script has circled since its opening sentence. That freezer didn't disappear once Richard buried Tina beneath the stairs. At some point in the years that followed, while the whole country believed Tina was still out there, somewhere, waiting to be found, Richard offered that same freezer, for free, to Tina's own cousin. Someone in Tina's family very nearly brought home the exact freezer her body had been kept in, and had no way of knowing it. One question was never answered in that courtroom: how a body, buried beneath a staircase in a house Gardaí had already searched, went undetected for 6.5 years. If this case meant something to you, sharing it costs nothing and helps this story reach the people who need to hear it. Drop your verdict below. I'll see you on the next case.